Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for our program, Navigating the New Cyber Incident Reporting Requirements, hosted by AIS Network and Williams Mullen. My name is Chris McDonald, and I serve as Director of Government Relations at Williams Mullen. I'm joined here today by my colleague, Patrick Cushing, the Vice Chair of our Government Relations section. Patrick and I are pleased to moderate today's webinar. Today, we're joined by three speakers who will provide really actionable information and insight into new legislation and how to respond to cybersecurity incidents. First up, we'll hear from Jeremy Bennett with the Virginia Association of Counties, or VACO. Jeremy has served as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs at the Virginia Association of Counties since 2018. In this capacity, he advocates for local government priorities in the fields of K-12 education, commerce and labor, and general government, which includes cybersecurity. Prior to his service with VACO, Jeremy was a lobbyist with the Virginia School Boards Association and a congressional staffer. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that Jeremy and I were colleagues at VACO for several years. So Jeremy, it's great to have you back and be working with you today. Next up, we have Eddie McAndrew, the COO and CIO of AIS Network, a Richmond-based information technology services and consulting company recently named to the Inc. 5000 list of the fastest growing private companies for a second year in a row. Eddie is a seasoned IT professional with over 25 years of information technology and governance risk and compliance consulting experience in both the public and private sectors. He's a certified information systems security professional and has exposure to cybersecurity from a range of perspectives, including work as a CISO and a cybersecurity consultant. And last, but certainly not least, Kevin Pomfret is the co-chair of the Data Protection and Cybersecurity practice here at Williams Mullen. Kevin advises clients on a wide range of data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity measures. In this capacity, he regularly drafts privacy statements and internal policies and procedures, negotiates privacy and information security contract provisions, and assists clients and organizations that have suffered data breaches and other cyber incidents. So Jeremy, Eddie, Kevin, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Please.
Pleasure to be here.
Before we kick off our program, I do have a quick few housekeeping items to go over. At any point during the presentation, you may submit questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will turn to questions at the end of the presentation. If you're having any audio or technical problems, please use that same Q&A button, and our helpful marketing team will get those issues resolved for you. And finally, no need to write down everything you see on the slides today. Everyone will receive a copy of this presentation by email later today. So without further ado, let's get started. Jeremy, why don't you kick things off for us?
Great. Well, thank you, Chris, for that lovely introduction. And it's great to be working with you again on this issue. And I also would want to thank AIS Networks for their partnership with VACO and Williams Mullen for inviting me and also hosting this event. So I thought what we'd do to start off is just kind of give some context about recent cybersecurity incidents before we get into the context of how the legislation that was introduced and enacted this past session, how that really impacts some of our members in local government and really just public bodies across the Commonwealth. So, going into the 2022 General Assembly session, the issue of cybersecurity was really kind of front and center with a lot of legislators and just the state in general. As many of you may recall, in December of 2021, there was a ransomware attack on the Virginia General Assembly that basically shut down the Division of Legislative Services a month before the session was to start. And for those of you like me who deal with a lot of advocacy and lobbying, you know that that is kind of a critical time for legislators and their staff in preparing for debate and discussion and enactment of all these bills. So the inability to access that system to do those tasks really kind of scared everyone and really, again, put that issue front and center. Now, of course, that wasn't the first time that there's been a major cyber incident. And we talk about local government and cyber attacks. One of the biggest ones I'd like to just cite, and the biggest in terms of its impact, was the 2019 Baltimore ransomware attack. And that was a variant of the Robinhood ransomware. And basically, it shut down all the city servers and really impacted the ability of a local government, in this case, the city of Baltimore, to basically do the business of governing. And whether that's, city employees having access to their email, being able to issue water bills, real estate sales, all of that was impacted. And it really was, kind of a perfect storm of factors that led to it, where there were bad IT practices, and also a failure of the city to allocate adequate funding for cybersecurity insurance. And we might touch on that issue a little bit later, but that's part of this larger conversation. And really what ended up happening was the city basically had to spend $18 million to kind of rebuild their system. And as of even April of this year, they're still 3 years out from this initial incident. They're still dealing with the consequences of that. Some of their teachers are having really trouble accessing some of their insurance information and their ability to manage that. So that's one notable incident, but it's part of a larger trend in cybersecurity where, we've seen in the past 3 years, 100% increase in the number of cyber security incident claims. And, just even last year, risk insurers paid out on over 8,100 different cybersecurity claims. So this is definitely a pressing issue. And, if we could advance to the next slide, that's kind of the where we were going into the session. So there were two bills introduced, HB 1290 and SB 764, one by Delegate Cliff Hayes, who used to be the former chair of the Communications, Technology, and Innovation Committee, and then the other by Senator Barker, who's chair of the General Laws and Technology Committee in the Senate. And basically the original legislation, and it's linked in here if you want to actually read the text, it would require every public body in the Commonwealth to report all known incidents that threaten the security of the Commonwealth's data or communications, or results in exposure of protected data, and all other incidents compromising the security of a public body's IT systems with the potential to cause major disruptions or to normal activities. So, when we talk about public bodies, we're talking about political subdivisions, so local governments, school boards, but we're also talking about executive branch agencies, legislative commissions, universities. I mean, basically, we're just covering the whole gamut. And this was legislation that was brought forward at the request of the Virginia IT Agency, or as you all know better, VITA, and supported by Governor Youngkin and his administration. And really, again, it is trying to capture a picture of all cybersecurity incidents that are impacting public bodies in Virginia, so that we can get a better sense of what the major threats are out there, and what those disruptions are doing to local governing bodies and other public bodies. So if we go to the next slide. So the legislation originally required that these incidents be reported directly to VITA. We were very fortunate to work with the bill patrons and to work with VITA to amend the legislation to change that reporting requirement to go through the Virginia Fusion Center, which is run by the Virginia State Police. And for those of you familiar with the Virginia Fusion Center, there are protections from Freedom of Information, FOIA requests that protect the confidentiality and immunity of that information. So when you talk with cybersecurity experts and cyber insurers, protecting that critical data and that information is vital to how you respond to a cyber incident. So having that FOIA protections is very good, and we appreciate that the bill patrons and VITA were able to compromise on that. There was the legislation as it currently stands, it does require that an incident be reported within 24 hours of initial discovery. We, in local government, we tried to get a little bit more flexibility in terms of the reporting requirement, but unfortunately, it did end up being that 24. And the legislation was well received by the legislature. As you can see, the vote margins in the House and the Senate, there were only seven legislators who objected to this. So if we go to the next slide. And part of that requirement in the incident reporting, and I know Eddie's going to talk about that actual process, but the bill did require that the CIO of VITA, Bob Osmond, that they convene a work group to review current cybersecurity reporting and information sharing practices and report that information to the General Assembly. And as part of that work group, which I was fortunate enough to sit on, and I know Eddie attended as well, and among others in local government and other public bodies, we met about 3 or 4 times, and we're really able to kind of give our input and feedback on the reporting website, and to, again, minimize the burden on public bodies, but still, create a system it's in the spirit of the legislation, and also allows the VITA to kind of, and the state to kind of get a better picture of what's going on out there. And I just mentioned, I'll mention briefly before turning it over to Eddie, there is another work group that is going to be convened by VITA looking at cybersecurity. And this is budget language that requires the creation of a work group with representatives from the state and local government and other entities to basically determine a process for the allocation of Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funds, IIJA, the Federal Infrastructure Act, about $25 million in funding that will help bolster local and other systems on cybersecurity. So that work group hasn't been announced yet, but that's something just for our members to keep in mind going forward. But Chris, that kind of just is the overview of how we got to where we are. I think I'll turn it over to Eddie about what the actual reporting requirements are and that process. But hope that's helpful, just giving us some context in terms of where we got to where we are.
Next slide. Hi, I'm Eddie McAndrew, CIO at AIS Network. And I'd also like to thank Mullen for hosting this session and providing the opportunity to really reach out to the community to understand what we need to do to work together and how we can leverage this process. The question that I've most often encountered as it relates to this legislation is, should our report rises to the level of significance that would merit reporting? And if you look at the legislation, threaten the security of Commonwealth data, the potential to cause major disruption, let's face it, I mean, in the end, there are going to be a lot of instances where it's going to be a judgment call. But a couple of things that I would point out. One, it's confidential. As Jeremy noted, the FOIA requests, the Freedom of Information requests, are protected vis-a-vis the Fusion Center. And secondly, it provides tracking data that really is for the benefit of all. One of the challenges that we in the cyber community face is the reluctance on the part of organizations that have an incident to report that or to let it be known. For fear of the problems that it might cause. And so what results is a dearth of information in terms of really understanding what's happening within the community, what the cyber profile is looking like, and information that will help all people across the community to proactively take action that will be to the benefit of all. So my inclination, my recommendation is, when in doubt, report. Take advantage of what's been put in place to really help everybody. Working together is going to provide the best defense for everyone. So my suggestion is, take advantage of the process and report when in doubt. Next slide. So when you go to the report website, one of the things that I would recommend you do right off the bat is look at the frequently asked questions, the FAQs. The link is on the deck below, and this, as noted, will be sent out. But it really provides a lot of great information that will help you through this process. What's a cybersecurity incident? There are some examples there. What should be reported and when? Are the reports confidential? Will I be contacted? So I would take a little bit of time, it's only a few minutes, to read through the FAQs, and I think that'll really position you to report with ease. Next slide. So logistics of reporting an incident. One of the things that I think has really come through loud and clear from a design concept, and Jeremy alluded to this, is making it easy for the organizations to report an incident. The link is there, go check it out. First, you're gonna look at, is it executive branch or other organizations? The legislation applies to all public bodies. Most of the entries are buttons or drop-down lists, again, to minimize the time and effort to report something. And there really is only a minimal amount of information that's required to be able to report the incident. And some of those examples are on here. So, I mean, the bottom line is it's easy to submit an incident. So again, back to really working to make the cyber and the IT and organizations across the board more able to respond to, track, and really put in place proactive action around cybersecurity. This is a great tool to help make that happen. Next slide. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of other great sources of information related to cybersecurity. First, you'll note is the Fusion Center, which is linked to, partly separate than the reporting site. It was a collaborative effort that was put in place after 9/11 as a way to really close the intelligence gaps. It's a fantastic resource. I highly suggest you take a look at that. It'll really help you understand what's going on within the state across the country. Another one is the CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. This is a federal agency focused on cyber. There's a lot of great information on there, tips and blogs. And as a CISO, I used it to provide monthly tips to my organization as a really a security awareness tool. But it also provides information around the latest threats and really has a pulse on what's happening within the cyber world. And then finally, and there are a plethora of different resources for cyber out there, but the Center for Internet Security is a really great resource for helping you to build your program, to maintain your program, to understand what the best practices are within the cyber community and within your IT and cyber program to position yourself with a sound cybersecurity posture. So I would highly recommend you take a look at these. So if you have any questions either now or later, feel free to contact me. Feel free to reach out to us at AIS Network. We're more than happy to help. Again, thanks for the opportunity to Williams, Mullen, and Jeremy. It's been great working with you at VACO. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Pomper.
Thank you, Eddie. Next slide, please. So first of all, I just want to build on what Jeremy and Eddie have said. I think that they've provided a really good background in terms of how we got here and what's in the legislation and why it's important outside of what the law requires, but also important to report incidents so that there can become a body of knowledge and we can be better prepared as a Commonwealth, as a country, to be able to deal with these issues, because they're not going away, they're only increasing, and sharing knowledge is important. I'm only going to touch on a couple of things that, as a lawyer, as I look at the language that sort of jumped out at me, and these aren't meant as criticisms, but just sort of things that if I was counseling an organization dealing with this, what some of the things I would point out. And the first one is the public body shall report incidents that threaten the security. And I focus on the threaten because I think that's a term that is very, or could be interpreted very broadly. And what that means and how that should be applied, I think will be a little bit, could be difficult as a lawyer when you get specific fact patterns in terms, is this a threat? Is a disgruntled employee leaving, saying something, sending an email? Is that an incident that threatens the security? So, and I'll mention this throughout, I think the best way to deal with this is as you develop your incident response policies and procedures, to just try to come up with a definition or a sense of who's going to be responsible for defining what that term means, so that you can have a standard response throughout, and internally how you're going to handle situations. Because I don't think there's a right or wrong answer necessarily, but I do think you want to be consistent in your approach and transparent, so that something does happen, there's no uncertainty. The other part of that section that I thought was interesting was exposure of systems, exposure of data that's protected by federal or state law. That's a pretty broad definition. So for instance, Virginia has trade secret law. There are federal laws requiring the protection of unclassified but controlled information. And I'm just wondering if organizations are going to necessarily know all the different things within there, all the systems and data within their organization that are protected by all the different types of federal or state law. So again, what I would suggest is, as you're developing your incident response policies, to do a inventory of what laws might be applicable to your situation, where that data is, who's storing it, who has access to it, so that if something were to happen, you'd be able to know what does and doesn't apply. And then the third piece is just because of the broad definition of public bodies, which I think is fairly standard. But it does come to mind, or for me anyways, how do you deal with the private sector citizen members on these boards? And if, for instance, there was a phishing incident with an individual on his or her personal email account that somehow led to disclosure of information that might be associated with a public body, what's the responsibility for the public body to report that incident? And how do you notify the individuals that they should let you know, right? And what responsibility do they have? And do you include that now in your training and your responsibilities for private sector or citizen members to come on board and participate in these things? Again, I think it's important because we're all connected, but it is something that sort of jumped out at me in terms of thinking through what you're going to be doing, how you're going to respond to this, and making sure that organizations have consistent and transparent policies and procedures in place as these incidents arise. Because there will be questions, particularly in any new law, but particularly something around cybersecurity. There will be questions that arise, and they will be very fact dependent, but you want to have some basis to make those decisions so that you can be consistent. And that's it for me. So next slide. I think we got a question slide.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for the information this morning. A lot of really interesting information, a lot of good insights into kind of where we were and why we've gotten to where we are. We do have a few minutes for questions, and we've gotten a couple in the chat. I'll throw them both out now. I think one is probably best suited for Jeremy. We did get a question about where does risk insurance fall into kind of all of this, and then a second question that maybe Eddie might be best at answering about, do we have any recommendations for assessing your organization or any services to conduct testing or probing? So I'll let you all take those.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. I'll just start off on touching on risk insurance, and then I'll turn things over to Eddie to address the other question. And really just want to, Kevin did a great job in terms of laying out the considerations that you should be thinking about when you're responding to a cyber incident. But a lot of our members already have risk insurance policies in place that specifically deal with cybersecurity. So when you're thinking about your response and you're in doubt, review your existing policies, and certainly feel free to contact your risk insurers. I know a lot of our members are very fortunate to have a relationship with our partner at VACORP, and they do a great cybersecurity response program. So if you do have a cybersecurity response, make sure you're touching base with either VACORP or another risk insurer, because the last thing you want to do is in your good intentions to respond to an incident and report that incident, you don't want to risk jeopardizing your coverage. So just make sure that you're in line with those policies and you're talking with your risk insurers.
Yeah, so in terms of your question, do we have any recommendations for assessing your organization? Sure. One of the things to keep in mind is that risk assessments can be done at the enterprise level, at the system level, at the application level. I think one of the questions you're going to ask yourself is, do we do it ourselves? Do we bring in a third party? It's great to bring in a third party. Certainly we at AIS Network do risk assessments at any of those levels. And one of the things I would look to if you're going to bring in a third party, have them help you to understand the process, right? Work through your risk assessment with them, or go out to the CIS, that has the Center for Internet Security, has information on doing risk assessments. And you can certainly look at NIST 853. which will provide a catalog of areas to look across at. In terms of services to conduct testing, really, what we do on the systems that we host, and really is the best practice, is to do vulnerability scanning monthly, right? And you know, one of the most common vectors of attack is systems that are out of date, drivers that are not updated, patched appropriately, OS levels out. So you'll find those things through vulnerability testing or scanning, and that'll give you some good results. And then you should really look to do penetration testing, ideally once in a while with a third party, but do penetration testing at least annually, if not biannually. And of course, it depends on, you know, the level of risk in your data itself. So if it's sensitive data, then you want to have a higher level. Certainly feel free to reach out to me. We recently at AIS did a webinar with the Insurance Association in Virginia. And it goes into some good detail on whether you want to do it internally or externally and how to approach that. So if anyone is interested, I'd be happy to send along that deck, which details information along with that. And Paige, it's good to see you're out there live and kicking, and thanks for the plug on the CISA website.
Going to say, yeah, Paige Brothers has commented that the CISA website has an incredible template to get people started on developing their plan. Our agency found the CISA free resources very helpful, so a good plug for that. We are just about out of time, so I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank everyone for tuning in your questions. If we did not get to your questions, we will reach out to you directly with more information. But thank you all. We look forward to seeing you at another one of these. Please don't hesitate to reach out with further questions, and we're happy to help. So thank you so much.